Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. You can watch this episode on YouTube and Spotify. Today, we're talking 5G, conspiracy theories, and what makes people vulnerable, and RFK Jr., who was a natural case study of conspiracy. Speaking of RFK Jr., the measles outbreak in West Texas continues now with over 700 cases identified. Kennedy seems to have backpedaled a bit on the MMR vaccine, telling us that the vaccine will slow the spread. Yet, according to NBC News, he's also said, quote, "We're always going to have measles no matter what happens as the vaccine wanes very quickly," which is a great setup for today's episode with Dr. Eoin Flaherty of Maynooth University in Ireland. Dr. Flaherty introduced me to the phenomenon of a post-truth era, which unfortunately is a perfect fit for our current political environment. Dr. Flaherty is interested in how patterns of inequality are formed and maintained and how they change. He studies these processes over time and space with a particular focus on income inequality during the late 20th and early 21st century, and instances of famine during the 19th century, mainly in Ireland now. He also studies how human societies have formed systems of cooperation and managed resources collectively, and whether such systems are more resilient to environmental stress. I found him via the article, The Conspiracy of COVID-19 and 5G, Spatial Analysis, Fallacies in the Age of Data Democratization, which he co-authored. Oh, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Folks have been asking for this topic for months, if not years. Can you just tell me what 5G is? It's a mystery, honestly, to me.
Okay, so 5G is the most recent in a long line of mobile communication technologies. So I guess the difference between 5G and 4G, and kind of part of the reason, I guess, why it's become so controversial, is that, first of all, it's more efficient in terms of the way it delivers data to the user's phones. But in the way that it's set up, unlike 4G, it also requires a sort of a denser network of towers. It takes more towers than the 5G, which tended to use a smaller sort of centralized tower for distribution.
Okay.
So you'll see more of them. The trade-off then in terms of, say, 4G versus 5G is the efficiency and the bandwidth, of course, at which it delivers data to the user's phones, making it much faster, much more efficient.
And so is 5G Wi-Fi? Is Wi-Fi 5G? Is there still 4G and 3G out there? I know I'm missing a lot here.
Yeah, it varies country to country. In the Irish case, yes, there would be, because depending where you are, the rollout of 5G could be more advanced or less advanced. So just to give the example of where I am in Ireland, for over the past 3 years, as the 5G network was being rolled out, users could access a coverage map where they could see shaded areas where 4G was covered. And then kind of, if you'd looked 3 years ago, 5G coverage would have been centered on cities. Again, the towers that provide 5G coverage have a relatively shorter range. So they need to roll that out by putting more towers in place all around, which is why you tend to get it first in cities and then later across the country. And that's the pattern globally as well, is that it tends to first be rolled out in cities or areas with high urban densities. Which matters later on when we get to talk about some of the conspiracy theories that came up around COVID. But in terms of Wi-Fi, so yes, they are similar in terms of that they are both different variations of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, but they do very different things. Okay. So your Wi-Fi router in your home is part of the same family in terms of that it's non-ionizing radiation. So it's not the harmful type of radiation that we would associate with, say, X-rays or UV exposure or things like that. So they are both involved in delivering data, just under different conditions, different bandwidths. Some with narrow coverage like Wi-Fi, which, if you walk far enough within your home, you'll lose signal. Whereas 5G, if you're within proximity to a tower, you can go quite far.
Great. So we're talking about, like, on our phone, it's like data versus Wi-Fi.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So generally speaking, when you're in your home on a broadband Wi-Fi connection as well, again, depends on where you are. In cities, 5G coverage now can be quite fast, if not faster than, say, a domestic Wi-Fi router. Yeah. So I live in the country, so my 5G in the town is going to be faster than my Wi-Fi in the country. But again, it varies. It depends place to place what the network coverage is like.
Okay. And you mentioned radiation already. And if folks have listened to like through there, they might already have concerns about radiation. Can you tell me about this radiation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this matters a lot to how people interpret the risks of things like 5G. Radiation is a very general term that just describes the movement of energy through the air, through space, essentially.
Okay.
And within that spectrum, there's going to be a lot of different components. You could think of it sort of like Toyota as a manufacturer of cars, with the Camry as one brand of car. Therefore, radiation is the broad category, and then 5G, radio, gamma, and so on are different sort of makes or types within that. So anything like the more common communication technologies, cell phones, 5G, Wi-Fi, are all in what we would call the non-ionizing category. The ones that are in the ionizing category, like X-rays, like UV light, are the ones with the potential to cause disruption to cells, depending on your exposure, the level of exposure, the time, frequency, duration, and so on. In the ionizing range, that can be very dangerous. So if you're at the dentist and you're getting an X-ray of your mouth, your dentist will leave the room.
Yes.
Just to minimize their exposure. In the non-ionizing range, there is no evidence whatsoever that it has any potential to cause any type of harm. And that's true of 4G, of 5G, of Wi-Fi, of cell phones.
Okay. So why do people think that the radiation from 5G is going to make us ill, kill us, give us cancer?
I think there's a long history to this. So I would say one of the first things comes back to a very common issue, which is around the public misunderstanding of science. The term radiation has particular connotations. Anyone that's grown up in the 80s and 90s watching movies about nuclear fallout and disasters, you hear radiation, you think, oh my God. But then there's also another history to that, which is about nuclear power and nuclear accidents. Like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island in the US. So all of these things have fixed in the public consciousness a very particular interpretation of the term radiation. And they usually associate that with harm. Whereas in fact, in the science community, it's just a very generic term that describes the movement and transmission of energy as particle or wave. Now, if we look back at the history of the Gs, which would be 3G, 4G, and 5G, principally, we start to notice an interesting pattern. So around 2003 into 2004, we see the emergence of Middle East respiratory syndrome, which coincides with the initial rollout of 3G. In 2008, 2009, we have swine flu, which also coincides with the rollout of 4G. Then in 2020, we have COVID-19 and the rollout of 5G. So these are coincident events, right, that have no underlying connection. They just happen to occur at the same time. Lots of other things occurred at the same time. But you pair that sort of contentious history of ideas around radiation, mobile technology, communication. And again, at the time, 2002, 2003, it's coming at a time of, I think, in some extent, after the dot-com collapse, the bubble has burst around public confidence in tech firms to some extent. So there's that context of skepticism as well, that big companies are acting in the best interest of everyone. So you put all these things together. By the time 5G comes along, there's already a well-established narrative and suspicion around communication technologies that's quite fixed in the public mind. And then from that, other stories start to step in to sort of fill the explanatory gap about, why would corporations do this? In whose interest is it to provide, damaging radiation? And then a lot of that backstory gets filled by some of the other conspiracy theories that I'd imagine we'll probably get into soon.
Well, I think it's, now that I'm hearing about these correlations, I'm like, prove that it's not. And then the burden is on you to give me all of the data to prove that it's not. That sounds exhausting.
It is. And I guess I was thinking about it before today and as well, and I thought it must be, insofar as I would have sympathy for it, I think to actually believe that you're surrounded by 5G and all of these waves all the time, but to believe that's harmful must be incredibly distressing. So, I do have some sympathy with people in that regard, but it doesn't change the fact that actually fundamentally we have very good knowledge and years of information. And this is everything from, studies of long-term exposure and so on to, direct analysis or studies of radio equipment or communication equipment that show that there really is zero harm. And at the moment, that is the position of the FDA, the FCC in the US, the European Commission, that classify communications technologies as essentially non-harmful. it's very difficult to respond to as well without individualizing it. And these beliefs tend to be so deeply held as well. When you present yourself as, with an opposing response, it's often taken very personally.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that people often see it, I guess part of one of the benefits that psychologists note from conspiracist beliefs is that it gives you a feeling of agency, first of all, control, that you have privileged information or knowledge that others don't.
Yeah.
So, one of the other strands of research as well is about how do we get out of this? And while the answer definitely is that it's a collective problem, conspiracy ideas proliferate in times of gross inequality. When education funding is being rolled back, and that, it all starts there, which makes, I guess, the deprogramming or redirection aspect of it very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak more to that vulnerability?
Yeah, I think, what really interested me as a sociologist was, so first of all, we have a lot of psychology studies that would say that people have fundamental dispositions towards pattern detection. So seeing patterns and things that aren't really there, like patternicity. Okay. And yes, there's certainly good evidence for that. But as a sociologist, I'm really interested in the historical patterns that we can see around this, and how the social environment of the time actually plays a really strong explanatory role. It explains a lot about how and why these things emerge and when they do.
Okay.
So if we go all the way back to 1903, one of the most famous instances, I suppose, of a conspiracy is probably the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which came out in 1903, which essentially laid out a very extensive anti-Semitic conspiracy about Jewish supremacy, which again found its way into the curricula of Nazi Germany. And then we see that evolve over time as well, so that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene made constant reference to George Soros. And then only yesterday, Elon Musk on stage in Wisconsin, again, he starts getting heckled in the crowd, and he turns and he says, "Oh, hey, say hi to George for me," implying that the dissenters are a Soros plant. So that side of anti-Semitism has a history that goes way before the 1900s, of course. But to understand that the modern context of like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Musk talking about George Soros, you've got to go back almost 120 years. And so that's where a lot of the susceptibility to these more modern ideas has its roots in the not so distant past. So one of the things we see now is that we're coming around, say, 2011, 2012, we entered a point in the US where income inequality had reached a point that it hadn't seen since the Great Depression, since 1929. So inequality has never been worse. And one of the consequences of inequality, of course, is it has implications for education. And we know from study after study, what are the characteristics that make someone more likely to believe in conspiracy theories? It is education, so lower level of education. Okay. Political party affiliation plays a role as well. There's a recent study that shows that in many southern states, with strong Republican presence, I should say, that belief in conspiracism is stronger. So that it's not just the fact that you're in a southern state, it's that you're a member or you have an affiliation with a particular party. Okay. And all of these factors together make you more likely to believe.
So with the Marjorie Taylor Greene and Elon of it all, do you think they actually believe these things, or they're like, it's nice to pull on these like threads to engage a questionable community?
I think in the case of Greene, yes, I think she is a believer. No, I can't say for certain, but Marjorie Taylor Greene came to prominence on the back of QAnon, which was cast our minds back to 2015-16, the Trump-Clinton campaign. I mean, QAnon was a huge feature of that. And the narrative of QAnon was that Donald Trump was working behind the scenes to essentially dismantle a Democrat-led cabal of satanic Democrat pedophiles.
Yes.
Now,
pizza,
the way that
included.
The Pizzagate, yeah. And so Greene was part of that early sort of network of dissemination. She was aware of it. She was definitely on the receiving end of the messages. And then in 2020, she starts to distance herself from it. And then some old tweets resurface. There's a couple of articles that have been published about this. Similarly, I mean, people like RFK Jr., has raised questions ever since the assassination of his father in 1999. He's raised questions about the culpability of the culprit. He's been a long-standing advocate of the vaccine autism theory as well, even after the discreditation of Andrew Wakefield. So I would probably categorize people like that have that history and pedigree of action in those spaces. For Musk, I imagine it's much more opportunistic and convenient. And it's important to remember as well that Musk is someone who has pulled on narratives of DEI when it suited him, who has turned on that again when it suited his interests, because, of course, one of the things we know is that Republican-dominated political systems benefit the wealthy. So it is absolutely in his interest to support a conservative agenda.
Yeah. And
part of amplifying that agenda, of course, now is about parroting the lines of conspiracism, which he has done.
The RFK of it all is interesting. So do you think he is more vulnerable, or would we be, sorry, you're not going to diagnose him, we're not going to do that, but it seems like he went through enough things growing up so that he would be more vulnerable to trying to find or seek patterns in things? I don't know.
I think so, yeah. I mean, he was from the very earliest days, and I think what's really important here in the case of RFK to remember is that one of the most enduring conspiracies in US history is the belief that Oswald didn't act alone.
Yes.
And actually, funny enough, there's been some studies before and after the release of the JFK movie, and I think it was either 1992 or 1994, that up until that point, various agencies have done polls at various points throughout the 80s, and had found that about 10%, 11% of the American public did not believe that Oswald acted alone. In the year after the release of the movie, it was up at about 30%.
Wow.
So that sort of, that narrative attached to the Kennedy family, and there's other stories as well that they're amongst different members of his family, means that by the time RFK Sr. is assassinated in 1999, that RFK Jr. is approaching this with that legacy, I suppose, of a conspiracist narrative. On the back of very strong public belief that the FBI were involved in the assassination of JFK, for which, of course, there's very little evidence. And I think you combine that with the fact that he already had, I suppose he had a very strong pedigree around that time as well in the emergent sort of conspiracist space. I mean, he was the founder of an organization called Children's Health Defense, which was, again, vaccine hesitant, vaccine skeptic. So I think, yes, probably, and again, it's about the social context as well. It's a context that enables and validates and rewards beliefs in these kind of tropes. And certainly the history of RFK Jr. would suggest that, yes, there was that space for him to occupy, and that actually these narratives served him quite well in that. But to that extent, I would say, yes, he probably is a true believer.
Yeah. Oh, man. True. I have heard that term, but just in this context was fantastic. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he also wrote a book, and I think he talks in that about the role of Bill Gates. Now, at the time, there was a whole bunch of stories flying around about Gates that, the vaccines are going to implant nanomachines that would be activated by 5G signals. And, he was straight into that. I mean, his book is full of that kind of stuff. So these things do have consequences, actually, very, very real and quite serious consequences.
Yes. This came up after watching his Senate hearings and listening to podcasts on which he was interviewed, and he would just make numbers up, or perhaps he had looked at one number sometime and was able then to just come on a show and say that we spend twice as much money on diabetes care in this country as we do on defense. This is like, meanwhile, like, we know what we're doing across the world. But yeah, he just says that. What do you think? What's happening?
I think there's a great concept that some sociologists started to use around the time of the Trump election, the first Trump election, which was the idea of a post-truth era. And according to this idea, they said that so the penalties for lying no longer apply to public officials and other people in the public domain. And the evidence for that, of course, was that Trump had essentially based a lot of his campaign claims on falsehoods. And not only was he not punished for it, he was actually rewarded. And then allied to this, during the second Trump term, a couple of months ago, Trump starts issuing, I think it was something 50-something executive orders in the first day. And many years prior to this, Naomi Klein wrote in The Shock Doctrine about how this is actually a very effective political target or political tactic because it causes confusion. So you bombard the public with, 50 really awful pieces of action. People don't know where to look or where to turn. And you put those two things together, right? First of all, you're not getting penalized for telling the truth, but then there's so much coming at you, so much complexity, so many different areas to keep an eye on, from, equality to defense spending, EDI, of course. that it makes it really difficult to respond to any of these.
Mm-hmm.
And so sociologists would say in that context, you can absolutely get away with making up figures like this.
Got it.
There's so much going on, people aren't going to notice, and there's not going to be a penalty. You think of elections, US elections in the past, where politicians were pilloried for the smallest mistakes or mispronunciations in the case of people like I think it was Quayle in the 1990s. So the old order of being punished or held to account for lying is no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of part of the explanation that sociologists would say accounts for a lot of why they keep getting away with this.
I remember it was even that would have been 2017 during Trump's inauguration when they were comparing the size, of Obama's and his, and Kellyanne Conway just flat out said, these are alternative facts. And I was like, this is a new era of my life right now.
And that's not just a US phenomenon either. During the Brexit campaign in the UK, Michael Gove came out and had this famous quote on British media where he was being interviewed about, and in the interview it was put to him, said, you've got multiple experts here telling you that this is going to be disastrous. And he interrupts kind of and he says, I think people have had quite enough of experts. This was one of the two big events in the post-truth era was, Gove's rejection of experts. And again, since then, of course, there's been the rise of public skepticism towards intellectuals, academics. So all of that creates a very fertile environment for falsehood to thrive.
Yeah. Is post-truth environment, like era, is that something that people say? Because I want to start saying it. Will people know what I mean? Do I have to qualify?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I think so. It was probably a term that went around a bit more frequently immediately after the Trump election.
Okay.
But I think it's definitely a very valid concept because it's quite clear in Trump version 2 that it still applies. The rules haven't changed.
And it's been there. This and what you've alluded to a bit, I know what the people aren't telling you, or I have, the real truth when people aren't telling you the full truth. That is very much like in the context of bro podcasts that I've talked about, the Joe Rogans, the Andrew Hubermans, even like the Mark Hymans and all the weird doctors that are out there. They're not telling you, but I'll tell you, I'm really for you. And what? But what is happening? I don't understand.
I think there's a number of explanations for this, but I always go back to the material interests. And quite often, I think a lot of these people are trying to sell something, promote something. So I think, and again, these things tend to have a very short issue attention cycle as well. You're talking a period of maybe 1.5 to 2 years, maybe for something like
Got it.
The 4 a.m. wake up and the exercise grind and that sort of thing.
I'm impressed that you pay attention. I assume that I'm the only one who is out there like trying to keep track of this silliness. But I the 4 a.m. wake up cycle.
Oh, they're out here too. Yeah. Those have become global in a way that they weren't maybe even 10, 15 years ago. But you're absolutely right. I mean, bro spaces like Joe Rogan. Yeah. Rogan is infamously ambiguous. He's championed some people of the left, platform people of the right, and seems to change his opinion as well, depending on who he's talking to.
Oh, yeah.
So Joe Rogan essentially is, in one sense, apolitical in that he doesn't come down on them. But then in one sense, a lot of the platform characters are very right-wing with very long right-wing credentials. But when Rogan contracted COVID, of course, he went straight onto his social media saying, we're throwing everything at it, ivermectin. And again, ivermectin was something that RFK Jr. talked about.
Do you want to talk about it?
I suppose it was one of several things that was there around the time that Trump came out, and there's a famous press conference in the White House where I think it's the Surgeon General is sitting aside, and Trump is asking a panel of media about whether cleansing the body with bleach would work, or injecting bleach. I think it was injecting bleach.
I'm sure.
And you can sort of see her sitting to the side,
the face, like this. Oh no! Yeah, I feel like that was when she was done. There's no reigning.
Yeah, and so Rogan was in that nexus, which lasted for a relatively short time, about a year, 2 years. But it did have a very direct effect on sales of ivermectin in the US. Yes. people did take that up as a viable cure, even though it was completely ineffective.
Yeah. Trampus Harmon, the farmer that we've had on here, went to go get some for a animal of his, and was asked if he wanted the flavored or the regular ivermectin. Like, did he want the green apple flavor? Regular one. Wow. Okay. He's like, no, I'm giving it to a cow. I don't need the flavored ivermectin.
I mean, there are lots of things in that space as well, which are, cures that you probably shouldn't be taking. I think the most recent one that I'm aware of is probably the raw milk trend.
Oh, yes.
We developed pasteurization for very good reason, because it's quite dangerous.
Yes, that's actually why we had him on here the first time, to tell us all about that. But here's a great transition. So Trampus of Harmon and Son Beef, I sent you some notes about the things that he's heard from his customers, including allergies to Wi-Fi and 5G, and that his chicken apparently not having that 5G and the Wi-Fi in it. What did you think of those notes?
I think it really underlines the misconception around the idea of radiation. If you're sitting under a light bulb, you're being exposed to radiation. If you've got a phone, your phone is going to exhibit a higher reading, let's say, than if you were standing 100 meters from a 5G tower.
Wait, reading of what? Waves? We're back to waves here?
Of a particular kind of EMG, electromagnetic.
That sounds scientific.
Let's say wave. But I think the key difference really is that these can be categorized very clearly into harmful, non-harmful, ionizing, non-ionizing. Okay. And in both contexts, I mean, they can, under the right conditions, play a very helpful role, as they do in mobile communications, but also X-rays.
Yes.
And radiotherapy and things like that.
Right.
I think if you go back to the issue of phones, I mean, the argument there is that the things that harm us are not necessarily or always the things linked to the objects or the devices. Like if we just take the 5G argument for the moment, right? One thing we do have very good evidence on about what is harmful is being online from a young age.
Okay.
Right. So regardless of what the phone is doing or emitting or receiving,
if
you're online, the younger you are, stuck to a screen, watching cartoons, being exposed to like the YouTube recommender and so on. We know that that's very harmful, and we've got evidence that it has effects on everything from literacy to numeracy. So it's not the properties of the object as such; they do essentially nothing. But it's the behaviors and the practices around technology that we've adopted that are harmful.
Okay. In
the case of the chicken, I mean, you probably should be concerned about the standards of production. So chlorine washed chicken, which was banned in the EU in 1997, was banned as a way of sort of pushing the burden of reform onto producers.
Okay.
Right. So when you were allowed to chlorinate chicken in the EU, it meant that you didn't really have to pay a whole lot of attention to the hygiene standards and production processes of your farm. You could do whatever you wanted because all the harmful stuff would get washed away at the end. So the ban comes about in 1997. It can't be practiced within the EU. You can't import chlorinated chicken, but it is still practiced in the US. And again, a lot of the reasons behind that is because of resistance to reform and regulation amongst the agricultural sector. It's much easier and it's much cheaper as well to maintain standards as they are rather than adopt more hygienic standards or better standards of production, essentially to improve conditions for the animal, which is why we still have it today. So that in itself would do more. There's no evidence, again, that chlorination is especially harmful to people.
Sure.
But it does have implications for the treatment of the animals and production and the meat industry and so on. And also exposure, I mean, in terms of UV, I mean, sunburn being outside, and the melanoma risk that comes with that as well. I mean, skin cancers are a huge issue globally. And if you were to frame it in terms of, to use the term radiation, UV radiation is the only one that you're likely to be exposed to day to day that's going to do you harm. Sunlight.
But to wrap around to Trampus's not chlorinated chicken, he was saying the idea for his chicken is because the 5G towers are like 5 miles away. Therefore, the high school in between his farm and that tower absorbs all of the 5G. And then by the time the waves get to him, they just don't exist anymore. Therefore, his unchlorinated, Wi-Fi free and 5G free chickens are going to be better than the ones, say, that were closer to the tower. Would you buy that?
Yeah. I mean, if this person is carrying with them a mobile phone, then the chicken is being exposed to more than if you had it close to the 5G tower in the first place. But again, the evidence on whether being on a phone, chronically as any harmful, there's a very small amount of evidence from a long time ago that very, very prolonged, actually holding a phone next to your head for a very, very, very long time, possibly might. But again, that's not globally accepted. I mean, those studies are very controversial, and there's no clear evidence for this. But for 5G, there is, and it's fairly unequivocal that it's completely harmless. There's no really sort of long-term or observational studies of this at all. It was hypothesized in the early days of cell phone technology that this might happen. And it's one of these things that has kind of stuck as well in the background of the narrative of, communications technologies causing harm. From my point of view as a sociologist, the harm is what they're doing with my data, or what they could do with my data.
Oh, yeah.
I'm much, much more concerned about that than anything related to the physical properties of the device.
Yes, it's all out there. I initially got to the 5G conspiracy theory of it all when hearing during COVID that was one of the causes. Truly, other than outside of data, had not ever heard anything about 5G or why people were concerned about it. It only seemed positive because the internet was faster. Turns out people like Woody Harrelson, celebrities, Candace Owens, were convinced that was contributing to COVID. And how does that work?
I mean, we tried to trace a little bit of the history of this in the paper that we wrote in 2022. And I mean, it was an unfortunate coincidence, I think, that the rollout of 5G also coincided with the outbreaks of COVID, which in the initial years was very much an urban phenomenon. But the problem arises when you overlay those two patterns together. So if you're in 2020, the highest density areas for COVID cases are within cities. Also, the most extensive 5G rollout and coverage is in cities as well. Now, so those are coincident patterns, but they're coincident for very different reasons. They're not causally connected. To be related, you would have had to have the 5G first, and then there would have to be some very straightforward transmission mechanism or process through which 5G amplified transmission. Now we have a very good understanding of how COVID-19 and coronaviruses transmit, but we were able to trace at least the initial propagation of this to a number of maps that were posted on, it was 4chan, Reddit, and then were amplified on Twitter.
Okay.
And so that's how it came about initially. And we talk a little bit in the paper about this conjunction fallacy that happens. I mean, it happens in all walks of life. I mean, lots of social events and phenomena are susceptible to this kind of conjunction fallacy. But unfortunately, this was how it started. This was the basis of the rumor, this map that overlaid the rates of COVID with 5G and showed, oh, look, they're all happening in the same place. But
okay. So is there some guy in his lazy boy? Who is the first? It's got to come from somewhere. Or were there 20 people thinking the same thing all at once? Sorry, this is kind of off topic, but could I just start a conspiracy theory from, I don't know, my living room? What?
It's very difficult to know. It's entirely possible that you could. Okay. But part of the reason we don't understand this entirely in the age of social media is because the algorithms of these social media sites are kind of black boxes in a way. We don't really know. Part of that is deliberate. It's actually interesting. One of the great areas of research that was emerging around the late 2019s, 2020s was coming from data scientists who were scraping Twitter and looking for kind of keyword patterns to see, what happens when a major public figure makes a controversial statement. Is there a spike in sentiment? Economists were using it as a way of measuring how happy people felt, as opposed to the economy might be growing, but is everyone happy? Let's gather these hundreds of thousands. And Elon Musk, when he took it over, shut down API access, which meant that researchers could no longer do that kind of work. Now, it seems it's certainly the case, and it's entirely plausible that multiple people at the same time have the same idea. Okay. But it's somewhat random and somewhat context dependent as well about what gets amplified. Now, one answer to that question of how it starts, actually, last week I was just reading Sarah Wynne Williams' book, Careless People, which is a memoir she published about her time at Facebook. She was the former head of international policy at Facebook. And in one of the chapters in her books, she describes the aftermath of the first Trump election, where the senior staff are kind of looking around and, she's trying to encourage them and trying to encourage Mark Zuckerberg to take some responsibility for the fact that his platform enabled essentially the Trump campaign to do targeted adverts. But she talks in that about the capacities of these systems, especially the recommender systems, to boost content and to send particular types of content to certain types of people. So they were able to target sort of hesitant voters who had expressed an interest or interacted with posts that were skeptical of Hillary Clinton, and they sent them propaganda saying not to vote. So in the chapter, she lays out an awful lot about how these systems sort of create, in a sense, very contained chambers of opinion where you're talking to the same kinds of people. And it's in that kind of environment that these conspiracy narratives take off. Because, again, the platform will work algorithmically to boost your interaction and exposure to the types of content that fit your interests. It's pattern-based. So, again, while we don't know the specifics about how that works, we know that's the environment where it happens. So, yeah, it's entirely possible one or two people can. But when it starts to take off, we know it's more likely to be shared within and among networks of people who share the same perspective as you.
So the next could be me.
Possibly. I mean, the difficulty with that is that another truism, I suppose, of social media, particularly with respect to advertising, is that controversial content is more profitable.
Yeah.
Generates more engagements. It's more attractive to advertisers.
Yes.
So while it's certainly possible you could, initiate your own, it would have to conform to certain characteristics to be more likely to go viral, especially within platforms like X, Twitter at the moment, where we're fairly sure are being algorithmically manipulated to boost certain types of content.
I'll have to keep that in mind. Okay. So the maps for 5G and COVID is definitely something that I saw in your paper. Was it just the maps? Like, how did celebrities and other folks just be like, yes, I agree? Were they just really like at home and sad and decided that this was a great way to channel their stuff? I don't know.
I mean, it's possible. One of the key turning points was when it was retweeted by a British councillor.
Okay.
And that was I should say that at the same time, while this is going on in the US, it's also going on in Britain.
Okay.
And actually in Ireland, there was one case of a 5G tower burning in quite close to Letterkenny in the northwest of the country. But it also happened in Britain. There was a 5G tower. There was a communications tower was targeted that carried not only 5G, but also it carried some critical equipment that handled emergency transmission. So for ambulances, it was quite close to a major hospital, which actually knocked out the medical communications as well as the 5G, and actually caused quite a lot of harm and delays. So this was going on at the same time. So again, it's often not the case that it's one individual. It's the proliferation of this content within spaces amongst people that share certain characteristics that are interested in the same things. And then you get key individuals across the world, like the celebrities you mentioned, the councillor in particular, that really boost it. And of course, people with that kind of reach as well will have a much more stronger effect on the proliferation of it than, we'll say, individual users like me.
Your paper also had the difference between conspiracism and conspiracy theory, which up until then I had thought were the same thing.
Yeah, I think they're quite similar. I think we use the term conspiracism to describe the social climate or the social environment. And conspiracism refers to a number of kind of characteristics or things that are there in the social and cultural zeitgeist that make it more likely for people to lean towards these types of stories or explanations.
Okay.
So conspiracism is a bunch of things all put together, which would be a widespread public distrust of power, structural powerlessness, which again, we know from many studies, what will predict your likelihood of engagement with or belief in conspiracies is feelings of powerlessness, being in poverty, low education, all of these things. So conspiracism describes that kind of a climate of high inequality, high disempowerment that makes conspiracist narratives more appealing. And then conspiracy theories are kind of like the discrete events or things. So these will be things like the JFK assassination, the UFO conspiracies of the 1980s, which again, they're very cyclical. They take off in the 50s. Except then the X-Files comes along in the 90s.
Fair, yes.
And one of the interesting things about conspiracy theories or conspiracism in general is that it is dominated by these big sort of epochal events or things or stories that are so big and all-encompassing. Like, the QAnon conspiracy it's a thing, but I mean, the potential explanatory power of QAnon is huge. If it's true, then it explains everything about wealth inequality, the actions of government, how government works, who the key players are. So, it's appealing as a simple explanation in that regard, because it explains much more simplistic than the real account what's actually going on. And that's part of what makes it attractive too.
True. When you're saying this now, and I've thought about it before, a conspiracy theory in the context of like health and power, in theory, like levels the playing field. Like the QAnon, the 5G conspiracies, and multiple COVID conspiracies seem to be like the government is doing these terrible things to all of the people, and we need to know these things. And a lot of the historical American white nonsense has been to particularly protect white folks. So I guess my question is there a theory that they are concerned about all Americans, or like specifically to America, like we're concerned about what's happening to like us white folks and we need to protect us?
I think so. I think a lot of these conspiracies are encoded with racial prejudice, gender prejudice.
Okay.
I think it's no coincidence that a lot of these concern men.
Yeah.
If you look at the major ones of the last 40, 50 years, JFK, Clarence Thomas, all of these different ones, like they often concern men, or they're related to male-dominated sectors like government, the military, industry, things like that. On the contrary, though, I mean, we do have good evidence about instances where governments have caused harm. I mean, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is a great example, which was an experimental study that involved only Black people, where they recruited a panel of individuals, 400 had contracted syphilis, and kept the observational study going even after the development of penicillin. And so, I mean, that was one of the, people often ask me, one question I get asked quite often is, can you think of any conspiracies that turned out to be true? Oh. And I think the things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment have all the hallmarks of a conspiracy theory, but were actually true. And in many respects, much more harmful than, any of the stories that we tell in the various conspiracy theories of the last 40 years.
Is there anything on these topics that you think would be important for folks to know or take away after listening to you?
One thing I get asked about sometimes is about what the solution to this is.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, one thing that concerned me, I think, from the Trump inauguration was seeing that lineup on stage of the Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and then later Musk with the DOGE, which is, I mean, in some respects appears to be a turnaround, but it's not really for Zuckerberg and Bezos. They've just changed their physical appearances. They do
right?
Male CEOs of a certain type, they do the martial arts thing, and then we have this moment where
grow a beard.
Zuckerberg has rebranded himself. I think Bill Burr said that quote on the Tonight Show. He said, "Why does Musk look like he's fallen out of a hot topic?" And part of the reason, it's very obvious why they're there, which is because they've all played a decisive role in some respects in the political career of Donald, and will continue to play a very decisive role in conservative politics. But I also think it's worrying because in many respects, they are the people that control the context of these. You've got Musk, who's in control of one of the largest social media platforms in the world. Beside him, Zuckerberg, not beside him, but he's in the same on the same stage. I think these people are very aware of the power that they wield over elections and decisions. And I think within that, conspiracism plays a very specific role in that as well. It facilitates their interests in a particular way. It does so by sowing mistrust in public institutions. And it does so technologically as well. I mean, they have the capacity to amplify particular kinds of message and target them, which was demonstrably true in the 2016 election, and comes through really well in Sarah Wynne Williams' book, Careless People. So my concern would be around that. I think it's no exaggeration when people talked about the emergence of an oligarchy.
Yes.
And one of the features, of course, of oligarchies and juntas and things like that is, of course, control of information. They know how powerful information is.
Yeah.
So until we get a rein on that particular, I suppose, distribution of power, that's the real problem. I think we're going to see a lot more of this, but being wielded in very particular ways.
That is a fantastic and sad way, poignant way to end this episode. Eoin, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Of course.
Thanks so much to Dr. Eoin Flaherty for coming on the show. As you heard, there was a brief mention of chlorinated chicken. The two of us got to chat a bit more about it before we got off the call, and I'll be bringing that piece of chicken, no, just joking, of the conversation back to you in an upcoming episode about food systems. If you're interested in more information about measles, its lack of treatment, immunity, amnesia, and Kennedy's lack of response, you can check out my interview with Dr. Bethany Johnson about Maha moms, measles, and medical history. Until then, friends, continue to make things awkward when you can. If you like this episode, you can write a review on Apple Podcasts. You can leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify. You can also follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to level up your support, you can join the Patreon. And right now, those funds will support a couple entries to the Signal Awards this year. I'm thinking of submitting an entry on Jeff Hutt and Making America Healthy Again Part 2, which was re-released last week. I'm Jessica Wilson, and you've been listening to Making It Awkward. It's edited by Jen Jacobs, who was able to decipher the truth from conspiracy. And this podcast is supported by the Legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services.